Greetings, friend, and welcome to the Between the Covers podcast, where we are working every day to remove the self-limiting beliefs that are preventing us from becoming the heroes of our own stories. I am Marcus Spar, and today I think we should talk about purity culture. This is something that I made mention to last year in one of the podcasts, and here I am towards the end of a rather busy week and feeling a little tired, so let's tackle something easy like purity culture. Before we dive into today's topic, I do just want to remind you that if you have any questions that you'd like to have answered on the podcast, or any topics of discussion, or any suggestions for heroes that we can interview or research for future hero studies, then take a look at the description where you can find the podcast page to my website where you can send any questions or suggestions. A lot of the individuals that I work with have had experiences with purity culture in the past, especially considering there's a good number of them who are of the Christian faith and wrestling with that faith, or maybe perfectly content in their faith. Yet, even if you did not have this kind of upbringing, I can almost guarantee that you have had some exposure to purity culture in one form or another. When I was going to school in the 90s and the early 2000s, one of the things that I remember hearing a lot was, especially as I started getting older and we were having conversations about puberty and your developing bodies and all the changes in life and hormones and all that stuff. One of the things that I heard quite a bit was the importance of abstinence only when we're talking about dating, sexual relationships, and pretty much waiting until you are married in order to be sexually active with someone. This is something that came from purity culture, and there are many, many schools that received some kind of curriculum where they, in a lot of cases, they might talk about different forms of contraception, but most of the time they wouldn't even consider that. There is this very interesting notion that if you talk about sex, if you talk about different forms of contraception, if you talk about the different parts of the human body of the opposite gender, then you are just going to create sex-craved teenagers, and so it's best not to talk about it. It is one of the things that has, in my experience, been a real blight on our modern industrialized society. The reason why I say that is because for a lot of these people, and I have been one of those who has witnessed this among my peers, that when you're told not to do something, what do you typically want to do? What you're told not to do. If you are told that you need to remain abstinent until you're married, you don't even talk about sex, or maybe you do have a sex talk, which we'll get to that in a little bit. One of the things that often happens is we see a curiosity that is seeded through this, and that often grows in this, we'll say, garden of misinformation, or not, maybe not even misinformation, a lack of information. I have seen it time and time again. The impact of avoiding this conversation, the conversation of sex in general. In fact, one of the things that I have become with many of my clients is I have become a sexpert, so to speak. There are a lot of people who will inquire with me about sex, about relationships, about marriage, because of my experience and my candid attitude towards this topic. I'm not afraid to talk about this. I don't shy away from the topic. This is contrary to how I grew up. And even in my growing up years, especially when I was a teenager, things were a little different in my home. If you grew up with your parents sitting you down at a certain age to have the sex talk, which as I got older, that just makes me laugh. The concept of a singular sex talk. I have always equated it to what we learn in education. You don't have a singular math talk. You don't have a history talk. You don't sit down and talk about this one time and then you're good. This is something that often needs to be reiterated, readdressed, and for many of us needs to be a safe place where we can ask questions. And with my family, one of the things that I saw was my parents sat us down, me and my two brothers, quite often. And they just gave us the space to talk and ask questions. And they even checked in with us to make sure that we were not being sexually abused or molested or anything like that. And I found a lot of people didn't have that experience. In fact, I have even heard from some of my clients that their parents didn't even have a sex talk with them. They would come home from school and find a book or a pamphlet that was just left out in their bedroom that was supposed to explain sex and sexuality and what was appropriate and what wasn't. And the parents didn't engage in anything beyond that. This is a huge failing on our society. Because the human nature is one that if you tell yourself, or you, not yourself, if you tell others that you can't have something, we instinctively want to have that. Even if you take these messages to heart and you do tell yourself, I can't do that, I can't go there, we are always going to push the boundaries. There seems to be something within the human experience that we are just going to see how close we can get to the edge without actually crossing over and falling off the trail. And when we do that, we inevitably fall. Purity culture as a whole was meant to help people to remain sexually pure. I use air quotes with that. Because there was concern that people would have extramarital affairs. They would engage in fornication. There might be some unwanted pregnancies. And yet, for all of the efforts and the endeavors of purity culture, these are things that still happen all the time. In fact, I remember hearing about people not wanting to be a statistic in the divorce rate, when we're all kind of statistics in that, whether we want to be or not. If you're married, you're a statistic in the divorce rate. Because for a lot of people, you either do divorce or you don't. Purity culture would often... I got really mixed messages, I'll be honest. I would hear from spiritual leaders and authorities about how the gift of sex was something that was so beautiful and sacred that you needed to save it for someone special. But then the other messages that I would hear much more frequently were about how gross and disgusting sex is. And I heard some very interesting examples. And these just infuriate me thinking about them. I have heard of leaders who have, I don't even just want to say spiritual leaders, we're also talking like family and community leaders who have used some of these examples where, say, you offer a stick of gum to someone, and it's like, would you like this piece of gum? Sure. Well, then they take the gum out of the wrapper, put it in their mouth, chew on it, pull it out, and say, okay, now do you want it? They're like, ooh, no, I don't want that after you chewed on it. And they say, this is what happens if you have sex before you're married. You are an already chewed up piece of gum, and no one wants you. Oh, the shame messages that come from that kind of story. I have heard of youth groups where a youth leader uses that message, or another one where they take a rose and they're talking about how beautiful this rose is. And everyone wants to have this beautiful rose, but then they hand it to one of the kids in the group, and then they instruct everyone to take a turn with this rose of throwing it on the ground, spitting on it, stepping on it, something to blemish this beauty. And then the leader will hold that up and say, this is what happens when you have sex before you're married. You become like this rose and no one wants you. I have heard stories, especially of young, impressionable teenage girls who hear this message and they internalize that message for being so unwanted and broken and disgraced because they had sex already. This, while it was intended to be something that was to help with this concept of beauty and purity, actually turned out to be something that was so harmful to so many people. Tell me if you haven't heard these kind of messages before, because, oh man, have I heard them, and many of my clients have heard these same messages. Men, stereotypically men in general, are ravenous sex fiends that their whole objective is to get into the pants of some woman or some girl. They can't control it. This is something that men will wrestle with their entire lives. If you're a man, or if you were brought up with a masculine orientation, is that a message that you received? It was one I heard a lot. that this was just a part of me and I was never going to win against it. And this is one of the things that's very nefarious about purity culture. And that is to protect a man from this sexual hunger and desire that he is just born with. It's the responsibility of the women to protect them. I remember being one of those incredibly judgmental people that would look at women wearing skirts and yoga pants and low-cut blouses and dresses, and I would judge them because they were making my life harder. And that is so wrong. It is so messed up. But that is how many, many people have been raised. It's a patriarchal message. The men are able to be themselves, and it's up to the women to be the gatekeepers of not just their own purity, but the purity of the men around them. That's so wrong. And it's something that continues even after marriage. Now, I have worked with a great number of people who have a part of their story being some unwanted sexual behavior in their life that they have just struggled to get rid of. We're talking pornography, maybe it's compulsive masturbation, maybe it's even chatting with people online and trying to connect or even elicit some kind of sexual encounter with a complete stranger. This is one of the things I have heard over and over again from those who are male-oriented or raised to be men, is that things would just be easier for them if the women around them just didn't dress so provocatively. And I have had to be the bearer of bad news, or maybe it's the bearer of good news, I don't know, that it's not the women's responsibility. We ultimately have the decision and we have the choice of what we do with the stimulus around us. And yet, if you were raised the way that I was, that was not the message you received. I was told that I had this insatiable desire within me that needed to wait until I was married. And then once I was married, I could enjoy all of the sex that I wanted. I'm sorry. That's not how it works. That is still very patriarchal in nature. I have heard over and over again, story after story after story, of a wife who finds infidelity as a part of her husband's behavior. And I am sticking specifically with the stereotypical roles of husband, wife, male, female, because this is where this really hits home. Or no, it doesn't really hit home. It's where I have seen this predominantly in the work that I do. A wife discovers infidelity from her husband. And it could be having an affair. For some, it could be the husband has secretly been looking at pornography. I can tell you with my partner Libby, that was a betrayal when she found out that As soon as we got married, yeah, I didn't give up my porn habit. Oftentimes, when this is brought up in even some marriage counseling, very predominantly though, this comes up in spiritual communities. The problem is not the man's. The problem is the woman's. It is assumed more often than not that the wife is not being as sexually available to her husband that she should be. And the blame falls on her. And I will reiterate again, this is so wrong. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. And yet, there has been this predominant motivator within Western society, I guess. I'm very familiar with my own upbringing and with those that I work with. Most of them are affluent white men who, and even some men of color that have received these messages before, that as soon as they have a partner that they can have sex with, that these unwanted struggles will go away. That's not how that works. It's really not. But that's what purity culture keeps telling us. You avoid this incredibly disgusting thing until you're married, and then it becomes the most beautiful thing in the world. Enjoy. What is often missing in a lot of this is the importance of intimacy. We're talking about a very intimate act between two people. And I want to absolutely specify here, I'm not saying between a man and a woman. This is between two people or more. We're talking about something that is intimate. We're talking about something that should be mutually pleasurable for everyone involved. And yet, what purity culture has often done is it has told women that their bodies are wrong, that they're bad, they have to cover up, and then as soon as they're married, their job is to service their husbands. If you're someone who has sexual experience, for a lot of people, men tend to be done sexually a lot faster than women are. And because of the patriarchal nature of purity culture and its messaging and its focus, really, as soon as the man has reached an orgasm, that's it. It's done. And there is a huge orgasm gap between men and women. I want to say I heard a stat somewhere that like less than 20 or 25% of women have ever experienced an orgasm. That's a problem. That is a problem that often comes from purity culture because it is so focused on the man and the women are shamed. I grew up with so much shame about my body because I had this insatiable desire that was given to me that I couldn't control, and I kept stimulating myself and I kept looking at pornography and I would feel so much shame. I felt like such a mistake. I felt like such a failure. I believe that there was no woman who would ever want to be in a relationship with me. There is so much shame that comes from this mentality, from what purity culture teaches us. So much shame. It's terrible. And I'm not just talking for those who were raised with a feminine orientation. I am talking about everyone who has received these messages has been harmed by it. There are masculine individuals who will use their sexuality as a means of power and authority over others. It's unfortunately something that I have seen over and over just from men who are in power. And don't get me wrong, it's not just men who abuse this power. There are women who will also engage in illicit sexual behavior. What we often hear, though, is if it is a woman who engages in this and uses sex as a means of power over a younger man, that's often glorified within masculine circles. It's celebrated. And so a lot of the evidence that we see actually comes from individuals in Hollywood, in politics, pastors and leaders in mega churches, and maybe not even mega churches. There is so much out there that has shown us that purity culture is not a good thing. We need to have honest conversations. You'll notice not one, not a sex talk. We need to have conversations about sex and sexuality, and it needs to be something that is safe. It is safe to talk about. It is safe to explore. It is safe to ask questions. It is safe for us to be able to discuss what is healthy, what is good, and maybe some things that aren't the best for us to be doing. That's going to be different for every person. However, the shame that comes from the messages of purity culture, those are messages that are causing so much harm and feeding into a culture of power and abuse. That's why I'm not afraid to talk about sex with people. I have literally seen some clients start to get uncomfortable while we're having conversations when I'm talking about sex because it's so unusual for someone to talk about this topic when they were raised with, we don't talk about that. That's a taboo subject. If this is something that you have wrestled with, just know you are not alone. There are many, many other people out there who have experienced this kind of abuse. If you haven't experienced this, then you are so lucky. I have not met anyone who has not experienced the harmful messages that come from purity culture. And if you need a safe place to talk about this, to process through the trauma and the shame and the guilt that comes from these messages, you are welcome to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk with you about this. If not me, then I hope that you find someone. I hope you find someone who is safe to talk about and explore these hurts and what really is something that is so good and beautiful about our existence. I will say one last time, if anything that I shared resonates with you, then you're not alone. There are, I would say, a majority of individuals who have gone through that same thing. I have heard of people who are close to me, or should say used to be close to me, who have harmed their children with these very same messages. And I have wrestled with what I can do in order to help mitigate that harm. It's a tough thing to deal with. It's a tough thing to deal with when you see people perpetuating these beliefs and these ideas and continuing this cycle of harm against others. Know that you are not alone. And there are safe people out there for you to work with, to talk with, who will help you process through this and ultimately come out on the other end, hopefully a much better and stronger person because of it. And until next time, live strong for today.